Good afternoon, Israelites. My name is Carl Byron Thompson, and I am an apostle of YAH and Yahshua. No man or no organization has called me. YAH has led me to this day to introduce myself to you and give you a revelation. He has called me to tell the world who the true Israelites are and return his covenant people home. My wife and I, we have a company. Yahweh directed us to develop or establish a corporation. The name of our business is Yahweh's Power Incorporated. So in all these years, it has been a 21-year process for me to sit here today and introduce myself to you. My journey began, mine and my wife's journey began 21 years ago. September the 19th of 2000, we were living in Ypsilanti, Michigan. We were in our bedroom praying, and we had a visitation by Yahshua, likewise like that of Paul on the road to Damascus. I went into a trance, and then I was stretched out on our bed, and Yahshua, the spirit of Yahshua, or Yahshua, embodied me, and he started talking to my wife. And one of the first things he said to her is, he said, "Trellis, I am here." So I could hear him. He was using my body, my voice, and I was stretched out on the bed, and I couldn't move. And so he talked to my wife for about 30 minutes or so. And then after the end of the conversation, it was like this great vacuum happened in the room. It went whoosh. And being new, not so much as a Christian, but not even a Christian people, but that's what I was back then. It was this big vacuum, and all of a sudden I cried for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, because it scared me. Didn't know what had happened. And so we were at a church in Milan, Michigan. And at the time, I had come back to the Most High. My wife and I were both. I was baptized back in, I think, either 1968 or 69. And around the year of 1978, I just walked away from Yah, more so because of the churches or the church. It was boring, and I just walked away from him. And so for years I wandered. And after the visitation, what we did is the pastor and the leaders of that particular church, we shared with them what had happened to us. And so we said, "Hey, this is what happened." And so they were kind of skeptical of us because we were new again to walking in with Yah and Yahshua. At the time, it was God and Jesus. And so they tried to take it upon themselves to mentor us, and that wasn't the case. So, and at that time, the manifestations or the anointing that he was placing upon me was starting to manifest itself. And so we were in a compassion ministries type of for feeding the poor. And I was always reluctant, and my wife was always the one who said, "Let's get involved." And so she almost had to drag me to certain ministries and such. But eventually I joined them, and in the manifestation of Yah upon my life, and the calling upon my life, and the anointing that he was placing in me began. And so some of the things that were happening, it scared church leaders and even the members of the church. And so from the time that he gave us a revelation that he was going to send us to Nairobi, Kenya, Africa for 3 years, and as he was doing this, I would share with those who were somewhat of a mentor to me and my wife. And they were looking at us like, well, Yah is not telling us. And so for all of you out there, this is kind of a side note. When Yah tells you to do something, obey him. Regardless of what is around you, obey Yahshua. Obey what they tell you to do. even though it might look crazy to others, obey him. And so for probably a year and a half after the visitation, there was that where I guess Yah was delivering me and it empowered me, where I would go up in front of the church after the church service, and sometimes for almost 3 or 4 hours, I would be laying in the spirit, and I would get like in what they call like the freestyle or wrestling, where I would get on my knees and I would just have my elbows on the floor and I would bang the floor, and I would turn, and my wife would sit there because at one point I had my wife sit there and guard me, because there was people that were close to us. And I remember sometimes they would ask these particular mentors or members of the church, what is happening? They said, we don't know. We don't know what is happening with this man. And they would give these stupid prayers about whatever. And at one point, I had my wife who was sitting next to me, and she would sit there for like 3 or 4 hours and sometimes she would say, you don't have to pray for him. He's okay. And we would, at the end, because there's always an altar call, and at the altar call is when I would go up and go over to the left side of this particular church, and immediately it would just start happening. And sometimes I would hit the floor so hard that I would knock the lighting out from underneath in the fixtures below us. And so it was scaring people. And so that happened for about a year and a half. And then finally, of August of 2002, Yah led me to give everything that we had. We gave all our belongings away. So we had China. We were staying in actually an apartment. We had just moved from Memphis, Tennessee. This was back in 1998. So in 2002, we still had things in storage and all, but we started giving away nice pictures, furniture, all our earthly belongings, and people were just like, they were freaking out because they didn't understand this. And this is one of those things where this was way beyond what they understood about who Yah is and who Yahshua is and the power of them. And so it took me about a whole month to give pretty much the majority of our belongings away. And this has been our journey. Like Paul, I'll quote this scripture, is Paul laments in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 9 through 13, that of the walk of a true apostle. And so in this time being, and I'll go back to this is the 21-year process. And so in this time that I sit from here, my wife and our family here, we have been homeless numerous times, that we have gone without vehicle. Particular jobs that I had was just enough for us to provide as a family. We live below the poverty line. So all these things that we had to go through was for the preparation of what he's getting ready to do for us as a people. And so in that, once again, I give them Yah most praise for the way that he has brought us through in some very difficult times. But go back to that particular scripture and read that. And Paul talks about that in terms of the hardships of what an apostle is. And I want to state this again. The apostle and the prophet are the foundation of the church. And so all of these naysayers and such, once again, biblically, I'm a biblical apostle called by the Most High and Yahshua. So going back, August of 2002, we set out. And at that time, our oldest, she was only 5 months old. So people had thought we had lost our minds. And one of the things that June of that year, in terms of my prayer time, one of the things that he told us, he said, you will travel by landmark. And so I wrote that down. And so once again, we walked out in faith. And so it took us 68 days to get to Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. And so the way that Yah did that is that we checked into a hotel and we ran out of money, and then that's when the fire began. And so what he would do in terms of while we were in Ypsilanti is that he would move us from one family to another family to another family. And at that point, we were losing our mind. And one of the people that we stayed with was a woman that we gave the majority of our belongings to. We had some beautiful Ethan Allen furniture, and so we stayed with her for probably about a month, her and her children. And in that time, we would look at some of the things that we gave her. We were eating off of plates that were once ours. So there was a great change in us in terms of tearing down the secularism in us, the value of things. And so great pain. And then from there, about that time, let's see here, around about the October of that year, probably October the 20th, I told my wife I quit this. And so I said, we're going to go back to my hometown, which was Lansing, Michigan. So YAH allowed us to go back to my hometown. And so my sister and her husband at the time were very gracious, and they allowed us to stay with them for about 4 nights. And I told Charles at the time, I said, I quit. I'm done with this. I don't want to do this any longer. And my wife, she has the gift of faith. And she was always the one who said, we must go forward. We must go forward. Now remember this, we had a 3-month-old child. And at that time we said to YAH, we give all to you. We even give her. So we had a 3-month-old. And at that time, after 4 days, my wife was saying, we have to leave. We have to leave. I'm thinking, I'm done with this. And that one, it was a Thursday night, and we were in their basement, and my sister came down the stairs. She said, hey, Carl, I need to talk to you. And I always use this phrase as, ding, ding time. And so went up and talked with her and her husband, and they were saying, you have to leave here. And we said, okay, because my sister, YAH told her that they weren't helping us. And so I said, okay. So I said, well, we'll leave tomorrow morning. And they said, that's fine. And so that morning we got up, and they were already headed off to work and all. And I don't know how much money we had at that point, but my sister, she gave me like $200. And so we went to the local Sam's, and we got diapers, and we got some sweatshirts or something like that, because it was starting to get cold. And let me back up. After the visitation, there was a couple of things that YAH told me. He said, one of the things he said, your walk will not be easy, but it will be good. And then he also said that he told me, you will never die. And at that point, all I could do was just write it down. Didn't understand what all this meant. And most recently, probably over the last, last 6 years, he emphasizes one important thing. He says, I will kill those who try to kill you. So the temperament, he had to build it in us, because some of these things, if he would have told me those the first week or so, I would have said, no, this is okay. But he constantly tells me that. He always reinforces that in me, that I will kill those who try to kill you. And now the revelation of that, when he actually told me that he was going to use me to address the world, and then also to bring his covenant people home, it was an overwhelming revelation. Okay, so back to the journey. The journey took 68 days. And so as we were leaving Lansing, Michigan, he said, go into Canada and do not return. And he always tells you that, because I'm the type of person who, at that stage, I was ready to quit several times. And so we went into Canada the following, probably that Friday night, And we went through Detroit, and we went into Ontario, Ontario. We spent a night there, and he would guide us. And so that following morning, he told me in Toronto, in Ontario, he said, "I'm going to talk to you in a new way." And so my wife said, so we had a Honda Accord, and we had our little belongings, and my wife and I and our youngest daughter, they were sitting in the back, and she would say, "Well, what's he saying?" And so all of a sudden he said, "Drive this way." And so he took me on a back road, and he led us into London, Ontario. So we spent a night there. And then that following day, we got up, and so we were thinking, okay, what do we do? So at that point, he hadn't said anything to me, so I knew that we had to get to a place where we could use the bathroom and we could get something to eat. At that time, I was on a fast. And so I found a place in London, Ontario. It was a McDonald's. And at that time, it was kind of like the area had, the businesses around there had been shut down. So that particular Sunday, we sat there in the car for about 8 hours. And we didn't know what to do. And then finally, as it hit dusk and it was turning into night, he said, "Now go to Toronto." And so I think London to Ontario, London to Toronto is about 230 miles. And so it took us about 3 hours to get there. And so once we got into the large city of Toronto, I didn't have a clue. So, we're here and I'm thinking, what do we do? And so what happened was that, like familiarity. So there was this one little banner that said Leslie Street. So I grew up in Lansing, and one of the streets that was in my neighborhood was the Leslie Street. And so I just said, we'll get off here. And so we immediately got off, and I pulled up it was a long boulevard, and pulled into a gas station, that had a convenience store, and I looked at my wife, and I threw the keys at her, and I said, "I quit. I'm going." So I just started walking, just like, "Oh, help me." And she just sat there and looked at me. I might have walked probably about 30 yards away from her, and I came back, and she kind of just smiled and looked at me, and I said, "Well, okay." And so I said, "We're done with this, and we're going back to Michigan." And I always had in the back of my mind, in the flesh and the human, I always had in my mind that I had an escape plan. And I always wanted to make sure that we had enough gas to get back to Michigan. And so we had about half a tank. We had enough money to get back to Michigan. So as we were heading back, my wife started saying, "Carl, you have to stop. You have to stop." And I'm thinking, I'm not stopping. And so YAH said to me, he said, "Stop." And I just kept driving. And then probably in another 5 minutes, his voice was a lot firmer, and he said, "Stop." And I'm going like, nope, I'm going to keep going. And then I remember at one point, he told me to tell my wife. I looked back at her, and he just said, and I told her, he just said everything is going to be okay. And then finally, the last time he said it, he said it in such a way that it shook me. He said, "Stop." And it was one of those where I knew if I didn't stop, he was going to do something to me. So we finally pulled over. And at this point, we were about 45 miles back out of Toronto. And so that was actually where was our home for several nights there. So it was, I think it was like exit 295 or 495, something like that, west. It was a McDonald's and a gasoline station, the truck stop. And so that night we just pulled over. We're thinking, this is crazy. I mean, but this was and this is our journey. And so that night we just pulled over, and my wife and our newborn daughter, they were in the back, and they had blankets and all like that. And so throughout the night, every 30 minutes or so, I would have to turn the car on just to keep us warm. And so that's the journey that we have walked. And so finally, what we were doing, we were looking for a particular church that was in Toronto. From the sister church that we came from, they were a partner church. So we were going to run to this church to have them help us. And so probably after 3 or 4 days, we connected with a woman who helped us. And she gave us probably, I don't know, about 15 Canadian dollars. And we actually at the same time called back to Ypsilanti, Michigan. And there were some people who said, we reached out to, and they were saying, we'll help you, but don't never tell anybody that we helped you. And so we were able to check into a travel lodge in Toronto, Canada. And actually the travel lodge at the time overlooked the Toronto airport. And so what had happened is that we were happy and we murmured and complained. We're saying we're never going to go back outside into that. And we murmured. And so what happened is we ran out of money and we had to go right back into the car. And so what we would do is that we would drive out 45 miles out from Toronto. That was our home. And then we would keep going back. And interestingly enough, that first time that we landed in on Leslie Street, we went to the library and I looked up 3 jewelry shops that I just wrote these things down and I put them in our little portfolio or whatever. So what happened was that we finally, probably the last week or so, we were desperate. So we went back to the car for like 4 more nights. And then YAH opened the door for us again. We reached out to some people and they actually, I had $2 in my pocket at that time. It was enough money to get back into Toronto, Canada. And so we immediately, the 3 jewelry shops that we had, they were all on the same block. And I think the name of the street is Yonge Street. And remember I said earlier that he said that you would travel through Landmark. And so we found out that there was a Landmark travel agency about 7 miles down from where we were actually trying to sell my wife's jewelry, the last of what we had. And so we went to the first jewelry shop. We were rough looking and they had a glass door. And we said, how much would you give us for this? And they said, we'll give you 300 Canadian dollars. And we said, that's not enough. So I cried and YAH said, keep going. So the next one was probably like 3 buildings down in the plaza area. And I went to him once again. This other one said, we knocked on the door, they looked at us and I said, how much would you give us for this? And they said, about $300. And we're thinking, oh my goodness. And I just cried again. And then finally there was one last one that was diagonally across the street. And so once again, we got out of the car and as I was walking into the jewelry shop, they had a big plaque on the back side of the wall there. And it was a kind of geometric type of a block. And it said Jesus on it. And we're thinking, oh, this must be the place. And so what happened was that we showed them what she had. She had a herringbone bracelet, necklace, and her engagement ring. And we said, how much would you give us for this? And they said, we'll give you about $1,500. And we said, really? And so we said, hold on. So what we did is that, I can't remember, but we went back to Landmark. I think earlier in the week, we went to Landmark and they told us how much we would need for tickets to go to Nairobi, Kenya. And it was like 2,981 Canadian dollars. And so we went back to the jewelry shop. We sold the jewelry. We checked back into the same hotel. And it was like room 414. And we called, once again, we called my sister and a brother, actually a brother Israelite who was at the church that we belonged to. And we called my sister and we called them and we said, just pray and then we'll call you back in 2 days and to see what you'll do. And so what we did is that we called back in 2 days and I asked my sister and she said, yeah, I can help you. I'll give you $500. And then we called the other family and they said they prayed on it and they were led to give us $500. So we were still short in terms of the monies. And there was another woman that was an Israelite that was at the church that we were belonging to while we were in Milan. And we asked her, could she help us out? She said, well, I don't have any money, but I can pay for 2 or 3 nights. And so we were able to actually raise the money and the tickets. We paid for the tickets. At one time we wanted to get just one way and the woman said, you can't do one way because it gives off a red flag. So we had to buy round trip tickets to Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. And so on November the 8th of 2002, we checked out from the hotel. We went over to the airport and we spent the whole day there. we had about $200 of cash in our pocket. And so throughout the day, we just waited the whole day. And at one point, I bought my wife a hamburger and some fries. And that was it. And so we got on the plane and off we went. And so we flew to Amsterdam. And I think we spent almost a whole half a night there. And then we got our connecting flight to Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. And then took about, I think it was about 8 hours or 9 hours from Amsterdam to Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. And so at that point, I was just totally terrified of what do we do now? And so we landed in Nairobi, Kenya, Africa on November the 9th of 2002. And while we were in line to get our visas, there was a elderly missionary couple. My wife started talking to her. They said, "Oh, it's easy to get your visa. What'll happen is that it's like $50 per person, and that's all you need." And I knew that because of that hamburger and fries that I spent for my wife, that we were going to be short. So we got to the counter and they asked us they said, "Oh, sure, $150. So we filled out the paperwork and we said, well, they said $150. And I told them we don't have the money. So, well, you don't get into the country. And I just broke down again. And so my wife, and at the time, I guess I always get this part mixed up, but our oldest was in a baby carriage. And so I guess she put the up on the counter, and the people looked at it and said, "Oh my goodness, the baby." And at the time, Charles was breastfeeding, so our youngest was big and healthy, and we were beat down. And the miracle is that they actually paid for the difference, the $7 difference, and then they gave me, at the time we didn't know what it was, but they gave us three $1,000 bills, which in equivalent now is about $20 in American money, 3,000 shillings. And the thing is, normally the gatekeepers, they usually take money from you. They don't give money to you. And so the next thing, I'm going to shorten this, is that all of a sudden we were led to get into a taxi, and the taxi driver was he was at the time a Christian, and we said, he said, where do you want to go? And we said, we don't know. And he said, YAH. He said, if there's a will, there will be a way. And so that whole night, he spent the whole night trying to find a place for us. So we ended up on the Boyd Road, which is Nairobi City Center. So it's the center of the city. And that's where we began our particular journey in Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. So we were there for almost 3 years. And so I'm kind of shortening this because I just want to give you an overview of who I am and where we're going from here. But it was a hard journey. I mean, but along the way, Yah would always bring into our lives wealthy Nairobi women. And actually the woman, this is amazing, the woman that was our caretaker for the last 19 months of our journey from Du Bois Road was about 4 or 5 business buildings down from us. And she was a textile woman who did a lot of traveling to Dubai to buy textiles. And she was a millionaire. And so for this woman, we did not meet up with her until, I think it's about 1.5 years later. And so we went through the fire in Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. We were in some places that were just horrible, but we were with the people. And so he would take us to a place like Karua Hill, Raruta, and then back to Lower Kabete, where it's a wealthy area, another woman that we connected with. And then my final place was a place that we landed on, but actually almost the same building. We were 3 buildings away from the place that we actually, when we arrived in Nairobi, Kenya, is where we took up lounging. It actually was the woman's, it was a flat or an apartment where she kept her textiles. And so along the way, in that was that of sending people to us. And so in that time, we didn't go to a church. He told us to stay in one place. And so what would happen is that they would say, there's a man of God. And so people would come to us. And so I anointed people to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. So my anointing is to cover those particular ministries. And so some of them that he had me sent one man immediately who's a prophet, to Ethiopia. And then another man I actually sent to South Africa. And so that was the birthing of my calling. And in that time, one of the last places that we went through hell in 18 months. And so this woman that he connected us with, she was disobedient. She had a place that she was supposed to have given us, a house, but another prophet dissuaded her against that. So we were always battling. And we ended up in this particular place that was sandwiched between two discos. And so for 19 months, every night, our walls would shake. And so when he said, your walk will not be easy, but it will be good. But we endured. And in that, we were there for, like I said, the last 19 months. And in that, we went through great struggles and pains, but we endured. And then finally, when we had to leave the country, we had to run out of that country. What happened is that we were going to set up a ministry there. And one of the men that I anointed to be an apostle, he and his wife had planned to steal the ministry from us. They were going to get the documentation that we had were going to give them to authorize a NGO, the ministry there at the time, and they were going to take over and they were going to do some weird stuff. And what happened is one of the pastors, who I didn't anoint, but was drawn to me, who was sent to me, he said, Apostle, he said, these people are trying to steal your ministry. So we ended up having to reverse all of that and fight our way. And we actually had to petition the United States government to return home. And so that has been our journey all along the way. And our journey, what Paul talks about, is that of the heavenly realms. And this is the dimensions, powers. And that's what an apostle does. An apostle battles in the heavens to bring down what's in the heavens to manifest upon earth. And so when we return to America, that was the 15 years of seclusion. And one of the things that he also said, he said, when I raise you from obscurity, you're going to reform, enlighten, and correct the body. And so in that time, we just became a normal family. I supported the family. My wife stayed home and raised the kids and educated the kids. And so we endured. And so finally, and one of the things that he told me while we were in Nairobi, Kenya, was we were with a woman by the name of Elizabeth Gatamba, and she was in Lower Kabete. And Lower Kabete was at one time a very popular area for the British who had colonized Kenya. So upscale homes, but I was in my prayer session, and one of the things he told me, he said, go to Fairfax, Virginia. And so that was in 2003. And so we arrived here in Virginia, September the 23rd of this year. So we have been in Virginia here and I'll tell you, in McLean, Virginia, Fairfax County, for about 2 months now. So it took us 18 years to get to this point where I'm sitting here sharing with you our journey and our mission. And so in that, we went through homelessness and all those things. And then finally, right after the outbreak of the COVID, we left Lansing, Michigan, and he led us to Texas. And so we moved to Texas and we arrived in Lake Dallas, Texas, March the 23rd of 2020. And from there, we spent 16 months in Texas. And along the way, he started to say, time is short, time is short, time is short. And that goes back to, I think it's Matthew chapter, let's see here, Matthew, I think it's like chapter 22 or something like that, where it talks about time being short. And time is short. And one of the things is, an example of that is we thought when we were going to Texas, we thought it was going to be for 3 years. And so actually when we got there, he sent us to several places. We were in Lake Dallas. We stayed there for about 4 weeks. Then he sent us to Louisville, Texas. And then he sent us down to Tyler, Texas. Then he brought us back up into Louisville. And then our final place for about 6 months was Denton, Texas. And at that time, we were remote. We didn't interact with anybody, and at the point, I sent out letters to a couple of ministries, Kajik, I can't remember the other one, and there was a prophet that Yahweh, 2 prophets that he wanted me to send information to, introducing ourselves to them, and explaining to them it's time to wake up. This is who you are. This is who we are, and this is what's getting ready to happen. And then around about August the 28th, in terms of our weekly time where we would sit down and we worship, and that's when he will start to have me write. And I have probably about 4 or 5 big volumes of 2-inch thick, this things that he has shared with me, the revelations, those unknown revelations that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1. Read that. He talks about the mysteries of YAH, how those are privy to the apostle. And so there's a lot that I have to share with you, but time is short. And so in that, I want to bring this to a conclusion. So it has been a 21-year journey at this point, 21 years of the preparation for what YAH is getting ready to do. And in that, once again, I said, he has called me to tell the world who the true Israelites are and to return his people, our people, back to the covenant land. And in that, now I'm going to say I turn 63 next month. And so there's some revelations, and quite a few revelations I will share with you in forthcoming videos. But once again, I want to thank you, and I will talk to you soon. Shalom.